Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning on the webinar for best practices in contractual risk transfer. We've got Brian Child from our office here at Olympus and Josh Collins, the city attorney for the city of South Salt Lake. Really appreciate you both taking a few minutes this morning. Thanks for jumping on.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, I'm Brian Child with Olympus, and Josh, I don't know if you want to give a quick introduction.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate both of you and everybody at Olympus letting me jump on this. I think solely for the reason that I'm in the same building as them is the only reason I'm here, but I'm certainly not a qualified insurance professional or anything else like that. But Brian and I do have a lot of conversations for these purposes and for my benefit, frankly. Just as a quick background, I've been an attorney for 10 years now. I graduated from Gonzaga. I started out in strictly prosecution and did that for 7 or 8 years until I switched over to the civil side and started working for the city of South Salt Lake 2018. Became the city attorney earlier this year and am very glad to be in this role. Has really opened my eyes to a different world of risk, I guess. Things that I didn't have to think about before. When I was a prosecutor, the only time I thought about insurance was when somebody got a ticket for no vehicle insurance. I just had to worry about whether or not they had it or if they've had that conviction before or whatever. Now this is, all sorts of weird things you never think about, inland marine and all those other nonsense things that you don't have to worry about when you're doing other stuff. And now you sort of have to worry about. So it's been good to have Brian and Taylor and everybody at Olympus help out. So thanks for letting me join in.
Appreciate it, Josh. Well, hopefully screen is up. So best practices in contractual risk transfer is our title, mainly because that sounded better than insurance requirements and how to not let your contractors get away with claims that you end up holding the bag for. Our objectives really are multifaceted. We want to hold third parties accountable and responsible for their acts of negligence so that we have a shield against those claims coming back to us as public agencies and utilities. Typically, those consist of contractors, facility users. Many of us have convention or other rental type spaces that we rent to users, or special events. And I know that's probably very timely since in the next 3 months, a lot of us probably have a lot of special event requests with the season, plus with the kind of the tail end of COVID. There seems to be a pretty significant number of those coming out, and hopefully give you some useful tools to watch out when you prepare those contracts and set insurance requirements for those. Insurance requirements typically consist of the coverage or the policies, and most contracts I see do a pretty good job at those. Occasionally we'll see some antiquated terms, things like public liability, but generally the policies are fairly on point. We'll get into a little bit more of the minutia here today, where we talk about some of the endorsements and other modifications that can really be the difference between having a claim be accepted when you tender it to a contractor or not. And then seemingly unending conversation for many of us regarding limit requirements. How much? We don't want to have too much, but we certainly don't want to be short. So that's kind of what we'll hope to cover. And kind of jumping into the deep end of the pool, and I know Josh and I have a lot of conversations about these along with many others. How do we grasp and tackle the limit requirements? Many of us have a default of either $1 million or 2 million and 3 million, 2 occurrence, 3 aggregate, to have some parity with the tort caps we have in the state of Utah. And I think that's not a bad starting point, but my hope is that we can have a little bit more science behind those when we look at really what can go wrong with a project. And I think we'll have a meaningful framework here where we look at the actual hazards of the project, what type of work is being completed, what's our proximity to the public. I think that can make a huge difference if you're installing a new water line through a farmer's field or adjacent to an elementary school when school is in session. And then the duration of a project. How long is this going to go? Is this a 2-week project, or is this a something that's going to take 18 months to accomplish, and we have a lot of exposure from a time standpoint? Another useful tool and that many clients use is a hazard matrix, and they have different scoring systems. We give these as kind of general recommendations, but many tailor these specific to their own organizations. But understanding these two points of the hazardous nature of an activity and the proximate or proximity to the public. Even seemingly low risk things like street sweeping when they're close to the public can be fairly dangerous and have pretty disastrous outcomes, as we'll go through some case studies in a bit. So some examples, and if we had time, I would have had everyone bring a couple of examples, because we all have unique contracts that seem to be round pegs in square holes. But some of these that we have dealt with just recently, this was just a list of some that I pulled from. Janitorial service. If we have a spec and we have a matrix as far as what limits we require, we might require $1 million for janitorial until we find out that cleaning the 10-story city hall was also bid as a janitorial contract with a $1 million limit when they're in a downtown area with a lot of people walking around the building, with people rappelling down the side to clean the windows who could drop things. Road resurfacing, water and sewer line replacement. A lot of that has to do with, number one, do we have redundancy? If they somehow impair our system, what would the potential loss or damage be? And what's the proximity, again, to people? And some of the common misconceptions, and Josh, I don't know if you want to chime in on these, but I know we've had quite a few conversations about them.
Yeah, so I would just looking at the screen, the first thing that comes to mind is in our city we have an arts council who does at least 2 events a year. Our arts council will sometimes attempt to be very generous with contractors and try to get people who haven't been involved before that are local. But we try to point out, some of the biggest red flags are like, do they actually have insurance? We had one where they tried to contract with someone to set up stage for an event. Obviously a pretty high risk activity, potential for a lot of problems, and they had no insurance. And so it's like, that's usually a sign, right? That they're not as reputable as they probably should be. And when they can't get that insurance, like, that's a problem. I don't know, but it was funny because when I first read this slide, I must have been tired. I was like, no, Brian, you got it all wrong. What are you talking about? No exceptions to be made for smaller contractors. But we've got to be careful, I think, just based on what we're dealing with, whether they're a small contractor or for a small project. My mayor says all the time that I live on the dark side, I think, and sometimes we have to really be careful not to go too far, but we've got to make sure, right, that that we're getting the right amount. So I don't know, Brian, I'll let you take over there, but that's the first thing that comes to mind is, we're setting up something, seems like you're helping out a smaller contractor, but it's a pretty high risk activity. They should have insurance, and we shouldn't be risking city property, public, all those problems that could happen just because we're trying to help out the little guy.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's something I hear, on at least a weekly basis, if not multiple times a week, that this is either a really small contract or really want to get really high participation, bidding this project. So we really want to have lower insurance requirements. And I understand where a lot of the procurement professionals come from, but also we have several pretty significant claim examples where it's a small contract. We had one that was a $300,000 contract that resulted in a $9 million claim with a contracted street sweeper to clean up a construction project as the trucks would go on and off the road. So I think it's important that we are careful about that, because these are areas that many of us are faced with, and on the surface it may make sense. Hey, it's only $300,000. Why would we require a $10 million limit for such a small thing? But certainly, looking at the risk, bad things can happen. Some case studies, and these all involve cities with the exception of the Provo Tabernacle. I included that one just because it's something many of us in Utah are very familiar with. But the others all include participation from public agencies or involvement in these claims. Wildfire has become a pretty significant concern this year. We already have a couple burning. I think one was already caused by a Dominion Energy contractor. So if we're doing work in a right of way, I think that in kind of a forested area, that's going to be an even more significant concern this year than in prior years. But we have seen water mains hit, sewer mains, the street sweeper claim I referenced. The Provo Tabernacle is a sad example where it was really just a lighting contractor that had pulled the recessed light out of its housing and set it on a very dry 100-year-old wood beam with it turned off. Another group comes in the next day during choir practice, turns on the light, which heats up. We all know this, what happened. It started the attic on fire and ultimately burned the building down. That lighting contractor, it's a very small contract, just replacing some light bulbs and recessed lights and a few fixtures, very small. And then if you look at the bottom two, those are rather significant, and those involve more professional liability exposures. In the case of the Miami-Dade College, the engineers didn't design the parking structure to adequately hold the load. It collapsed before it was even finished being built, and that was a total loss of $33 million. And then the Millennium Tower, which many of you probably are familiar with, it's been pretty highly publicized in the legal trade press and certainly the insurance trade press. 58-story luxury condo tower where people like Joe Montana have units is sinking and tilting. This really all started when they started the dewatering for the Salesforce Tower, which is adjacent to it, which the San Francisco RDA was involved in. So of that $100 million, the city and county of San Francisco is participating in, by paying $30 million of that to remedy the damage to that building, basically to shore it up. So certainly some things can become pretty significant. Couple of just unique areas we'll touch on briefly, but I think it's important everyone's aware of. If you're dealing with large contractors, they may be partially self-insured. And the difference between a self-insured retention that they may have and a deductible is they are going to be more in control of that claim with you being the additional insured. So I think you need to have a greater level of comfort with that contractor, with their choice of counsel, whereas with a deductible, an insurance company will be in the driver's seat for a claim and bill back, their client or their policyholder for the difference. So definitely something to be aware of when you're going out, especially building, when you have large projects. Financial strength, won't spend a lot of time on this other than just like our own bonds are rated by the ratings agencies, insurance companies are similarly evaluated. It's often not an issue because we have very high quality, large, highly reputable insurance companies. But occasionally we do see very small, thinly capitalized insurance companies come through. And I think it's important that the staff you have assigned to evaluate certificates of insurance are able to do a quick analysis or test on this, just to make sure you're not ending up with kind of a substandard insurance company that you're going to be relying on to ultimately pay a claim.
Yeah, I would just, if I can, Brian, sorry, I would
Please,
just point out
Josh, yeah.
along those lines, right? So those, you know, in my role as city attorney or whatever, that are doing trainings on a regular basis for whether it's for contracting or for insurance purposes, of training staff on how to check those things. And I know you're going to talk about this too, but just make sure that your staff is trained on a simple thing of logging in and checking online to see what their rating is. It's such a simple step and it's often overlooked. And I occasionally will do it just to make sure, you know, that staff has done it or that we're in a good spot there. But it's something that I would stress with your staff members who are over that, that they're checking that on every single one.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. You know, the AM Best, you know, the insurance companies are evaluated by Fitch and Moody's and Standard & Poor's, just as we are. AM Best is really the most thorough, and not all insurance companies are rated by those other agencies, but virtually all insurance companies are rated by AM Best. And if they're not, that's a fairly significant red flag as to why they've elected not to undergo an examination by AM Best. Typically, you know, a 10 or sometimes as low as an 8 from a financial size category is the minimum. And these financial size categories indicate unreserved policyholder surplus. So how much money they actually have in the bank that is not committed to existing claims is available. You know, it sounds like a big number if we look at a 10 or an X of $500 to $750 million. But when you look at the aggregate commitments that insurance company would have, you want to make sure they're there, especially if you're requiring some fairly significant limits, you know, a $10 million limit or something like that. From my own experience helping clients review these certificates, I can tell you, you're more common to see some of these questionable insurance companies for higher risk activities. So if you have something that seems fairly speculative, high risk, carnival operations, you know, they're often really exciting things as well, but they have a pretty significant risk profile. You're more likely to find these are going to be smaller insurance companies. Not to pick on THE, but you know, they're only a 7. They do have a positive outlook, which is good. A negative outlook always indicates you know, pending rating downgrade. But if you were getting a $10 million limit for something like a carnival, or you know, some kind of event in operations, and they have 50 million potentially in the bank, that is a little bit of a red flag. So something to be aware of as you go through this process. The same thing is available when you have payment and performance bonds for projects. The Treasury puts out issues what's called the Circular 570 that many of you are probably familiar with, but the Treasury goes through and evaluates all insurance companies and as to their you know, underwriting limitation for how much they can issue for a bond. You'll see many of those, you know, Chubb and Travelers Zurich are, you know, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But you'll also see some very small ones like that first one, they're accredited surety, 6.9 million. Many of us probably have projects that go well past, you know, $6.9 million. So we would want to be careful we're not getting a, you know, a bond from a surety that has exceeded their limit, because we've seen that happen as well. Policy forms, you know, many insurance companies use a third-party service to develop and issue their forms. It's called the Insurance Services Office or Service Office. But also many insurance companies use carrier forms or their own manuscript forms. So it's important that you recognize, especially if the policy you're receiving from a contractor is not an ISO form, it is not an apples to apples evaluation. There can be a lot of things that are fairly basic and standard in an ISO form that we're accustomed to seeing that would not be evident in an ISO form. Typically, you only see ISO forms also for general liability, auto liability, and excess liability, but any kind of professional liability or environmental liability, cyber liability, those will always be carrier specific forms. So I know it's not something that we all want to do for every project, but for those projects that we want to do a more thorough review, they're probably larger in nature, you know, a little bit more detailed due diligence process. Getting copies of those policies can be fruitful to find what you're actually getting. So we won't talk about every form of insurance you should require today, but these are the 8 key points, and they're kind of in order of criticality because number 1, if you hire someone and you let them on your site, workers' compensation is probably the most important thing you check. You know, work comp provides an exclusive remedy, so it's certainly something we want to make sure is in place for contractors and their employees doing work on our behalf. We're all familiar that if we don't have workers' compensation, or if they don't have workers' compensation, we become their statutory employer, and they have the cities or the districts or the counties workers' compensation policy, which can significantly, you know, impact us if they have a claim. Some things to be aware of there: you always want to have, you know, generally $1 million of employer's liability, a waiver of subrogation endorsement, and then one that's not as commonly seen but can be pretty significant is an alternate employer or alternative employer endorsement. And you need that endorsement if you are in a situation where you as an organization may be directing the work of someone else's employees with, you know, lots of interlocal cooperation and mutual aid agreements, especially I know in the public safety area, but I've also seen it in public works, where we may be directing a neighboring agency's employees. Having an alternate employer endorsement can shield us if there's an injury and they come back try and make a claim against us, since, you know, they have a work comp benefit already and they want to get a second you know, settlement from us. And one thing we recommend that everyone include in their spec is to exclude owners and officers from working, or excuse me, yeah, prohibit excluded owners or officers from working on your projects. Josh, do you want to kind of chime in on that? I know we've had several conversations about that over the years.
Sure, we've had probably too many conversations about it. This is one that really is a big deal for me, and Brian hears about it a lot. So we want to make sure that you do either or, right? So you have to either have no exclusion for the owners or officers, or you need to have language, in my opinion, in your contract that says if they're not, or if they are excluded, sorry, then they cannot perform work according to the contract. They are not part of the contract. They're completely excluded from the contract. And we've got language that we use that we've worked out and that I think fits the bill and makes that work. I always prefer that they're not excluded when we go through and look at the coverage, that they're included. Sometimes for smaller entities or other groups that you're working with, that may be cost prohibitive, or it just may not be practical. Construction, a few construction companies come to mind that we've had recently working in the city, where the owner is the name of the company, it's his company, but he's, you know, in his late 70s, he's not doing work. He and his wife own it. They're both listed. His wife has never shown up on a job site, but she is an owner. You know, those types of scenarios. But yeah, I get why they're not going to add them to the workers' comp coverage, and why they're going to keep them excluded. That's a cost savings to them. It makes sense. But at that point, you take those names if you've got them, or you use more general language that says, okay, so and so or any other excluded owner or officer cannot perform work according to this contract. That's the way we've worked around that, and I think it's gone pretty well so far because, and we'll get into this when we talk about case studies, but I mean, the potential for, I guess the only thing I can think of is the potential for blowing up your workers' comp is pretty high, and the cost to your entity, to the city, to whatever group you work for is extremely high if someone comes on and you know, one little injury could turn into way more than you think. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. A couple of real-world case studies that we've had happen. You know, a tree trimming contractor, the owner was excluded. It was after one of these really significant storms that we seem to have every, you know, 5 to 10 years in Utah, like we had last September. The crew he had working was getting behind, so the owner decided to chip in and help his employees out, and in the process managed to sever his hand, which is pretty grisly, obviously. Because he had excluded himself, he had no work comp benefit. He elected to sue, do a notice of claim and actually sue the special district that had hired him, based on the fact that they were supervising and directing the work of all these various tree trimmers, and that they had directed him to work in an unsafe manner, which seemed like a, you know, pretty wishful thinking. But unfortunately, they ended up settling that claim for around $150,000. So something that, you know, if you look at what's prescribed in the Work Comp Act, you would have received far less than that for the loss of his hand. It would have just been medicals, and then there's a kind of a lump sum indemnity payment you receive. But it would have been a far smoother process that instead of $150,000 plus legal. Another more significant one is we had a SWAT deployment where there were multiple agencies and friendly fire, where one officer ended up unfortunately shooting and killing another officer whose the batteries in his flashlight had burned out. So they didn't know he was, you know, on their side, so to speak. So these types of scenarios can happen. It's something we need to be aware of.
And I would just add real quick, just one more point about just the risk here, because there's a case from the Utah Supreme Court from, I think, 2019, Intercontinental Hotels Group versus the Labor Commission, where I think the Supreme Court expanded the potential for risk to employers. And just real briefly, I don't want to take too much time on this, but you know, the employee parked in the parking lot that was prescribed to park at that place, and while walking across the parking lot, tripped and fell and ended up with a pretty severe injury somehow. It was, according to the court, you know, clean, dry, clear day, clean parking lot. She ended up having her toe amputated, and workers' comp was said to be the remedy for her because she wasn't coming and going. It arose out of her employment, and they kind of said the parking lot of the premises where you're employed is going to almost always be considered on the premises of the employer. So that I thought really, for me, set the tone of what the court is willing to say falls under workers' compensation coverage, and also opened my eyes a little bit to how something so simple, walking from your car to the building, can cause a huge workers' comp claim. And for, you know, again, I have a hard time not like overthinking those types of things and kind of going crazy as far as like what the possibilities of harm are. But when things like that happen, it doesn't really help that anxiety that I have. So it makes me more concerned with these types of issues and making sure that we're really being careful with our language and what we're requiring.
That's a great example. Thanks, Josh. General liability is something we're probably all familiar with. Many of us may be less familiar with the fact that there are really 4 main coverage grants. And really the 2 that we worry about primarily when hiring contractors are bodily injury and property damage. Policy also affords full limits for personal injury and advertising injury. And then there are sub-limits for things like damage to premises rented to you, which used to be called fire legal liability, and medical payments. But we really won't get into those. You know, BI and PD are our 2 significant concerns here. People getting hurt or property becoming damaged in the course of a contract and a course of work being performed on our behalf. It's important to distinguish here that while many of the professional liability policies we'll talk about or environmental policies are issued on a per claim basis, limits are paid per claim, which we could have several claimants with unique claims. General liability policies are issued with an occurrence limit. One incident, multiple claimants will be aggregated to be paid under that one limit. The high points we really need to be aware of, in addition to just the obvious limit for BI and PD, are all of these endorsements, which we'll walk through in a little bit more detail in just a second. Some of the really common exclusions that you'll find on a general liability policy are listed here. Some things like the use of hot air balloons we may anticipate would be excluded, that you'd need separate aircraft liability. But if you look at these pollution exclusions, especially, a lot of the work we hire contractors to perform could, the claims that could arise could constitute pollution. Many of us have drinking water systems, we have sanitary sewer systems, we have areas where chemicals are used, whether that's demossing canals or reservoirs, or we have recreation facilities where we need like pool chemicals. But there are a lot of potential pollution exclusion issues. Special events, I know many of us have probably learned that there's not a lot of coverage on a standard GL policy for special events, but be aware of those. And then another one is most general liability policies have an exclusion for any work performed within a 50-foot right-of-way on a railroad. So we may hire a contractor to put new wire over a railroad right-of-way, or to bore beneath to put conduit or other utility lines, and that could potentially be a coverage issue if not remedied through endorsement. So additional insured status, kind of the holy grail we all hope to have when we set these contracts, in that if a claim occurs, we want to tender that claim and have our defense provided by the contractor's insurance company. I think that's the end goal for many of us, and really the objective of going through the exercise to shield us from these claims. And to do that, we need to do one of 2 things. We need to make sure we have that requirement in our contracts and in our agreements, and we need to make sure the contractor has the appropriate endorsements that will grant that additional insured status. Nearly all of the additional insured endorsements require that we have a written contract. In those rare instances where you need to be an additional insured and you do not have a written contract, you can get what's called a designated organization additional insured endorsement. It takes a little bit more time and it will cost the contractor a little bit more. And by a little bit more, it's $100 to $250. So it's very inexpensive. You need to be careful if you get a designated organization additional insured endorsement, because many of them still sneak in a requirement that says you must have a written contract, which kind of negates the intent there. So beware of those. I know it's a bit of a pain to get endorsements, but it is becoming a more significant issue where we actually have seen claims that we would anticipate a contractor's insurance company accepting not being accepted based on some of these, really formalities, but them not having the correct endorsement is the most common. And many of us know this, but certificates of insurance, over time, their value has really eroded. The disclaimer language at the top has become fairly robust and really says they don't convey any rights, and policy language will always supersede what's on the certificate. So while they're a useful tool and certainly a far more efficient tool than just getting copies of policies, just bear that in mind that certificate is just a snapshot, and if it's something we really need to dig into, we probably do need policy language or endorsements, if nothing else.
I can add real quick, Brian.
Yeah, please.
So just going back to that last statement that you were talking about, it's, you've got to be careful. If you see your contract only requires a certain level of coverage and they send you the certificate of insurance and it has a higher level of coverage, you might feel good about that, but just know that they're probably only going to pay out based on the coverage required by contract. So if you want a certain coverage, make sure that's written in your contract and not just rely on that certificate of insurance. So when you're pointing out, yeah, they don't convey additional insured status or any other rights, that's one thing to take into account. If they've got some other type of insurance coverage that you didn't require by contract and you're happy with that, and you think, oh, we're in good position, you probably should slow down and back up and either make sure that's in your contract if you need that, or just understand that you're probably not going to get that coverage actually, because if it's not in the contract, don't expect to get that coverage. I've had that come up a couple of times, not just with the city, but with some other entities I'm involved in, and I think it was one thing that you might get pushback from staff because it resets the process a little bit of negotiations and costs, et cetera. But if you need that coverage, make sure it's actually written in your contract.
That's a great point, Josh. Well, I'll show you a copy of an endorsement in a couple of slides that shows where there's really a clawback. So just as Josh mentioned, waiver of subrogation is a very common element to include in these contracts. Really prevents an insurance company from subrogating back against us. The textbook scenario is an contractor's employee is injured on our job site, a workers' compensation claim is paid, and then the workers' compensation insurance company pursues subrogation against the city for some kind of unsafe condition that we were responsible for. So it follows many of the same rules as additional insured status, where we must have it by endorsement, we must have it in a written contract, and it's typically available on general liability, auto liability, and workers' compensation policies. These are a couple of those sample endorsements I mentioned, and if you look at the bottom, and this is very small type, but we'll send the slides to everyone attending today. You'll see that bottom box in red. If coverage provided to the additional insured is required by contract, the insurance afforded to such will not be broader than that which you required. So to Josh's point, if you really want it, make sure you have it in the contract, because you can get a certificate with all of the bells and whistles, so to speak, but if it's not in your contract, you really won't receive that. The other thing to be aware of is additional insured endorsements are bifurcated for ongoing operations and completed operations. So if you have a project where you actually worry about a claim arising after the work is completed, the installation or construction of something where contractor packs up and leaves, and then there's some kind of defect left to cause a claim, to be an additional insured in that situation, you need a separate additional insured completed operations endorsement as well. So you really need two endorsements there. Primary non-contributory, we didn't really talk much about, but that just affirmatively states that contractors' limits will be exhausted before any participation by you as an organization or in your insurance or self-insurance program. Auto liability, obviously it's compulsory that we all have auto insurance. The test I often apply here is if a contractor can perform the work by taking public transit or by Ubering to and from the job site, we probably don't need auto liability because it's a fairly ancillary exposure of them parking in our parking lot. But if it's any more than that, even something as simple as catering, you know, Josh and I were talking about that the other day, where they probably parking up on a sidewalk close to a building. There's a lot of loading and unloading risk where those could be auto claims. It's important to have auto liability too. Symbol 1, you'll see on a certificate of insurance, there's an area for that, and that just specifies that any auto driven in that business, they don't have to be scheduled. So if they pick up a new auto, borrow, rent, fail to report a vehicle to their insurance company, it still has liability coverage. And the pollution liability for that auto is limited to the fluids used in the operation of the vehicle, like an upset and overturn situation. So if you have chlorine being delivered in bulk or anything else that could be considered some kind of pollutant, we'll talk about that in a second, you probably need pollution liability. Excess liability, again, just extends primarily general liability, auto liability, and the employer's liability, you know, Part B of a workers' compensation policy. The excess policies generally do not extend over other liability policies. And if a contractor presents that they do, you would want to verify that with actual copies of policy documents. It's kind of graphically illustrated here where you can see those 3 coverage areas typically fall under an excess liability or an umbrella policy to meet your limit requirement. Many of the other forms of liability insurance that you require would not fall under an umbrella. Occurrence and claims made, and this is going a little farther down the rabbit hole than I would ordinarily like to go, but I think it is important that we're all aware general liability policies are occurrence based, meaning those policies never die. And so if we become aware of a situation from 2014, we can go back to that insurance company for that contractor that was in place in 2014 and actually make a claim. And that policy is still alive to respond. Claims made policies are very common for all forms of professional liability. So if we, again, have a situation where we need to go back to 2014 and make a claim, the policy in force for that contractor today had better have a retroactive date that reaches back past when our potential claim occurred. And so the point we'll bring up with that is, you know, if we have work done, and pollution's a great example, and we become aware of an incident that happened, you know, 7 years ago, we're going to need to go back to that contractor and hope they kept that retroactive date. Sometimes in our contracts, especially for large capital projects, we can require that we will continue to receive evidence of policies that are claims made for you know, a set period of time. On the New World Trade Center, for example, that contractor is evidencing to the Port Authority 50 years of policies. In Utah, you know, we only have a 9-year really statute of limitations for most issues or less, but something to be aware of. Pollution liability. We see a lot of claims where general liability policies do not respond for contractors because the nature of the claim is considered to involve a pollutant, and most general liability policies have a total pollution exclusion. Occasionally, they'll give them a total pollution exclusion with a hostile fire exception. If there's smoke damage from a fire you cause, we won't consider that pollutant. I've included the definition of a pollutant over here on the left, and you'll see it's pretty all-encompassing. Anyone with a water utility, a sewer utility, even with third-party utilities that run through our system, like or our area, our city, like a crude oil pipeline, as there are several of those that go to the refineries, a Dominion gas line. If we hire a contractor to do work and they hit one of those lines, that would constitute, pollutant. And if they don't have either a separate pollution policy or a modified general liability policy, they're probably not going to have responsive coverage. Unfortunately, many of these are very, very recent claim examples, but just ones that I picked. Something we all do that own roads and some of the utilities in those roads. We raise manholes to have a street resurfaced while they're milling the road. They manage to, knock these manholes off, somehow plug a line, backup sewer into multiple homes. The sewer is considered a pollutant, so that general liability policy, unless it's modified or they have a separate policy, again, is most likely not going to respond to that claim, leaving us as a city in a fairly challenging situation with our constituents. Professional liability, or often referred to as errors and omissions policies, are really those where the nature of the claim doesn't necessarily result in bodily injury or property damage. It can, but the proximate cause was really that of giving a professional opinion. Everything from architects and engineers, which we're fairly used to seeing, financial advisors for restructuring our debt, medical malpractice, real estate consultants. Some of us hire security guards either for our own buildings or for construction sites, just like our own law enforcement agencies. They have a professional exposure. And then technology contractors is a big deal. Many of us hire groups to modify, update, and otherwise work on things like SCADA systems, where that's a pretty significant tech E&O risk, especially in light of the current cyber liability climate we're in, with a ransomware making the news every day. It's important to note that additional insured endorsements are not available for these policies, and that limits are typically inside, or defense costs are inside the limit. So we probably need to require more limit than less, knowing that there's not much like a general liability policy, or in contrast to a general liability policy where defense costs are outside, they're going to be inside the limit here. I'll give you a couple of examples. We've seen the headlines where SCADA systems have been hacked. We had one where the SCADA system wasn't necessarily hacked, but there was a bug, and on a weekend, the power went off at a sewer treatment plant. The SCADA system failed to turn on the backup generator, which led to the sewage, backing up the entire plant and then running down the road, all because of a programming error from a technology contractor. So those are the things to be aware of there. I apologize, I'm moving a little fast. I want to make sure we don't run out of time. We have a couple minutes for questions. Special events, and this is one, again, Josh and I have had quite a few conversations about. Many of us have a different risk appetite for permitting third-party special events on our premises, parks, street closures, and so forth. And many times, those events obtain special event liability policies. If there was a time to get a policy and read it, if nowhere else, it's probably worth it here, because there's just a short list from like the last 2 weeks of areas we found excluded in special event policies where the events had these exposures. So underwriters are issuing special event policies. People are purchasing them online without really any underwriting interaction with these kinds of exclusions. Some that are the most problematic are participants. If you have a road race, if you have a parade, if you have performers, the definition of a participant is extremely broad. And these special event policies with participant exclusion really take any hope of coverage away for those. So if we do have those, we either need to have it modified or they need to bring you a separate accident policy to cover those participants. So make sure you're checking those, because special events can be really exciting. There's a lot of new and, in my mind, seemingly high risk things, but they're probably just exciting things. But check to see what they're doing and if it matches what's actually in the policy, because some of these, I think we included in here. There's one that had, I didn't, objects being thrown. I did, flying or throwing objects. So that's a pretty, any carnival game you have set up, there's no coverage for any of those if you have this type of exclusion. And Josh, I don't want to skip over any comments you may have here. So do you have any thoughts on special events before we?
No, other than I always feel like I'm the one shutting it down when they don't want to get the coverage. I'm the no fun guy. I don't know, other cities have this, but our special event section of our code is clear that the city attorney is the one that determines the level of coverage for insurance. If you don't have that, it might be something to consider, because it's very helpful in controlling, even when sometimes it's like, maybe it fits in your special event category, maybe it doesn't, but you're really worried about the activity and the potential for coming back to the city if there ever is a permitted activity by the city. I regularly feel like I'm shutting down fireworks displays. I feel like a bad guy, but people just don't want to get a level of coverage that we would need for such a high risk activity. Things, you've got inflatables there, the bounce houses. That often really shocks people when they want to have a bounce house in our parks, and we say, well, you've got to have coverage. That sometimes makes people angry, and I'm glad I'm not the one speaking directly to them sometimes, that there's a buffer. But yeah, sometimes that's all I wanted to add. Sometimes I just feel like I'm the no fun guy, because people want to have a bounce house at their kid's party, and I'm saying, yeah, show me the insurance coverage and we can do it, no big deal. But that's it. Other than that.
No, thanks, Josh. It is a bit challenging when invariably they always come back and say, well, you're the only city or county that has these kind of strict limitations. Everyone else is fine with these activities or not having insurance for them. It seems like that's always the case too. Moving on quick, builder's risk. For many of you, this is something you deal with on a routine basis, and for some, it's fairly infrequent. But for those of you that build new facilities, builder's risk is typically a vertical facility, so not a pipeline or road resurfacing, but new buildings. Be careful on how you structure the builder's risk. Most of the AIA and other general conditions and contracts that a lot of us use and our contractors use default the builder's risk to be something wholly controlled and handled by our contractors. There's a couple of potential red flags there just to be aware of. Number one is it really takes you out of the driver's seat from a cost standpoint. It just becomes another line item. We've seen some pretty significant deltas in cost when owners have been building, example, it was a $30 million public works facility. The owner had allocated $75,000 for the builder's risk. And when the city looked at obtaining that coverage on their own, with probably better terms as far as things like earth movement and flood, they were able to purchase that policy for $25,000. So pretty drastic delta in the cost. Not saying the contractors will always not bring you the very best cost, but I think no one will probably be more careful than you as an owner. And so beware of that. You can control the cost and the terms. And then for those that have a lot of construction going on, you can also have master builder's risk policies, or with some of the larger property insurers like FM Global, they can actually embed builder's risk into that, where you really don't need to purchase separate coverage at all in certain instances. It's an automatic grant of coverage to where it's just straight savings by not having the contractor provide that. So something to be aware of. if you have kind of defaulted that to a contractor. Installation floater is the other area you'll see come up, and that's typically for things like pipelines and solar on buildings where you're not really building ground up, you're more installing equipment or pipe. We won't take time to go through each of these, but there are contracts out there where all of these could be applicable and needed. Drones are probably being used a lot more than any of us realize, especially on construction projects. D&O and employment practices liability, there are instances where those are needed, but not as common in crime. Garage keepers, any of us with a tow contract where vehicles are taken and kept at some kind of a lot, or any other, that's the primary risk for most of us, really. We need to make sure we have garage keepers liability for those tow contractors. Media liability, that covers the waterfront as far as libel, slander, copyright infringement, a lot of those things that can come up when we are either hiring someone to do media work for us or permitting them to do it on our behalf. And then property and inland marine, again, not common, but if we are permitting a contractor to use our equipment or facilities, either we are going to be insuring them still, or if we expect them to insure them, they need separate coverage where a liability policy wouldn't respond if it's in their care, custody, and control. Now, compliance, and this is where it's often hard. We get great specs in our contracts, but it's often a challenge to verify what we're actually receiving. So, certificates are probably the first thing. Endorsements are probably number two. For certain instances, it's really not unreasonable to request a certified copy of a policy, and that's a policy sent directly from an underwriter to you to ensure it's unaltered, as well as when verifying coverage to make sure that it's enforced before, during, and after the project. Most of the time, our projects don't line up with our contractor's policy period. So they're going to have a renewal, and we want to make sure all of those things we have requested are still enforced throughout the term. And then for those claims made policies, request that we have evidence of insurance through the warranty period. And sometimes that's a bit of a discussion or negotiation point, but if you can get 4 years after the fact from your, some professional contractors, that can help protect you down the road. Again, a sample certificate, which we won't go through here, but it's in the slides that we'll send you in case any of you would like to use that internally. And then we've left a couple of minutes. I know we're close. Looks like we have about 3 minutes for questions. Taylor, I don't know if we've had any come in, and I think under this type of format, we can actually unmute people if they would prefer just to chime in and ask their question in person.
Yeah, that's right. So if you want to raise your hand, if you're in the audience, I can click the button and allow you to unmute if you have any questions. I do have one that came through the chat feature, the questions feature, and okay. they asked if you'd comment on. It was really early on in the slides where we were talking about sometimes you have to make an exception to what you would generally require in order for somebody to be able to provide services, and how you go through that analysis. Where's the line is the question.
I think you really have to look at the worst case scenario. Kind of like Josh mentioned, at least this is what I recommend to our clients. And Josh, certainly you can chime in, but I always look at what can go wrong and setting the limit in accordance with that, because if you get significant pushback, that all of the stakeholders throughout the organization understand that we could face an over limits issue here, where the contractor doesn't have sufficient limits and the only one left kind of standing to respond to this claim would be us. And are we comfortable as an organization? Is our appetite for risk such that we're comfortable accepting that? I don't know if that answers the question, or if you'd like to raise your hand, whoever asked that question, we'd have to chat more about it, or offline too.
Yeah, I would just sort of chime in a little bit on that, and I think I understand what the question is, but if I don't, I'm really sorry. But everything is such a unique set of circumstances. It seems like, even it's the same type of contract, it's going to be the same type of coverage you would require, but everything can be really unique. And sometimes you've just got to make adjustments based on who's able to perform the services, what's the cost of the city, can the city pay a little bit more to help beef up that coverage? Sometimes, can the city buy that coverage for them, essentially by adding that price into the contract, to make sure that you have the right coverage if they're a smaller group that you want to help out. For example, when going back to my Arts Council example of, it may be a small contract. It's maybe the stage example I talked about was like a $400 contract, wasn't even a really big issue, but obviously with the stage, there's a lot of risk and liability. So the Arts Council was willing to chip in some money to help them buy insurance. And I think that's appropriate. And I think, I often am in the side of requiring probably too much, and I always have to call Brian or anybody other at Olympus and ask, like, am I asking for bear insurance? Am I asking, like, we've seen one bear in 30 years walk down the street, so now am I ramping up and charging everybody $5 million a year to protect against bears? That's a Simpsons episode that I always bring up, where Flanders sees a bear and it's the only bear in Springfield. Sorry, I'm wasting time, but it just makes me laugh because I'm always worried. Am I asking for the bear coverage here, or am I at the right spot? So it's difficult, and it's different every time.
All right, thank you so
Great point,
much.
Josh.
Any other questions? Looks like we're about there. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning, and thanks again, Josh, for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.